I'm going to suppose, and if you think this is wildly off, that's important, that the nature of the regime in structure in terms of political process is not what it was under Mao, that since around 1980, I mean, initially, Deng Xiaoping did make a big difference as a person. A system has evolved in which there's a collective leadership in which somebody has to assemble a coalition among factions, in which there's attention is paid to a lot of insightful technical expertise, and that this has to be done every 10 years. There's no charismatic leader with aspirations to be leader for life who can impose the megalomania that led to such horrors as the Great Famine under Mao. Now, the argument that this leadership makes, that it made, for example, in the wake of Tiananmen in 1989, is that the enormous liberation from poverty that has taken place depended on stability that required one-party rule. Not any kind of one-party rule would do it. I mean, Mobutu's Zaire was one-party rule, but this kind of one-party rule was necessary, and its form was sufficient. That doesn't strike me as stupid. The liberation of prices in the countryside had to be figured out through experiments, implemented then nationally with a two-tier system. It was going to give rise to discontent in the cities when prices were liberated. It did. That discontent had to be contained. Dismantling state-owned enterprises meant depriving lots of people of their iron rice bowl, their social security. That discontent had to be contained. Coastal development meant that there had to be transfers inland, which potentially caused resentment in the coast. That was done. That was all had a great potential for instability, which could have discouraged private enterprise and driven foreign direct investment away. So that's the pitch. I'm being a lawyer for the Standing Committee. And it doesn't sound like a dumb pitch. Is it plausible that in the past, liberation from chains of poverty did require stability that required one-party rule of the Chinese kind?
Well, there are many societies around the world which do not have one-party state but are still quite stable. And what is stability? Is a perceived reality. A one-party system perceives stability as any threat, perceive instability as any threat that they don't want. I mean, so it's a very slippery road. If you talk about stability, what is instability? If you have protests, does it mean that the whole society is going to collapse, will be in chaos? So the kind of stability that you talk about, I don't see as a necessary outcome of one-party rule. One-party rule can have all sorts of social situation, and the U.S. or any other third world country, they are stable, but they're not one-party state. So why is it so necessary to have one-party state in order to maintain stability? And what kind of stability are we talking about? When you say that there's no challenge to the one-party rule, that's stability. Well, that's one kind of stability. But if you have people orderly protesting on the street, it doesn't, it doesn't necessarily break the economy. So I think that line about stability and economic performance in China in the past decades is the line that the party like people to accept, but which I don't think it holds if you become more rigorous in terms of defining what is stability and show up more. There's no comparison. I mean, show me comparative evidence to say that if you don't have one-party rule, then no society will be stable enough to develop, and that in order to develop a stability, you need a one-party rule. I think we need somebody to do that kind of rigorous analysis to establish the causal relation between one-party rule and the outcome in the economy. And I want to add one point, which is that if you think the collective leadership, that is the one-party state has changed internally from Mao's time, this one person ruling and deciding everything, to now what they say they are doing collective leadership. I think the trend is going backward under the new leader, Xi Jinping, because he is known to centralize all kinds of powers. He is the head of different leading teams about the economy, about security, about everything. He's centralizing power in himself. He's dismantling whatever collective leadership the past regimes, the reform regimes in the past few decades have established. And it's widely circulated on the internet in China that this is the trend. And people are fearful that even within the party, what people have called in the past 20 years or so increasing internal democracy is being wiped away. There is a danger that this new leader, he is so untrustful of the bureaucracy itself that they think the officials, who are not the direct descendants of revolutionary families like himself is, the officials are the one who would destroy the party. He's not trusting even his own colleagues inside the party. The centralization trend, centralization of power in himself as the leader of these different leading groups inside the party apparatus, is what gets people worried, that not only is he not allowing more freedom in society, but even within the party, he's centralizing power.
Let's look at that future trend.
I think you should talk to Tony Sage about this, because he's the one talking about the party. I'm just reporting what I read in the newspaper. So don't hold me for my opinion.
Well,
I'm just reporting what I read. But I'm sure this is the opinion that you'll find among Chinese intellectuals, people who know about the party in China. Now, what Tony thinks, I think I feel more comfortable listening to him. If you want some
you're both our stars. You're our co-stars. Let's talk about now and the future. I just do want to mention something that, of course, impresses people. You asked, what's the evidence that one-party rule is necessary that goes beyond these theories, basically about the need to combine sequencing of entry into a full market system with a reasonable amount of stability. And you're saying, why is one-party regime necessary? Nobody thinks it's sufficient, or else Zaire would have done wonderfully since it was a one-party regime. Think of countries in the 20th century. Before the 20th century, it's not clear how many countries you could talk about as democracies that developed. So think of the 20th century. Think of reasonably large countries that started out very poor in this path. 1980, China, 85% were below $1 a day. How many countries have entered not a sphere of prosperity, but that middle income sphere where dire poverty has become something on the order of the 10% that there is now in China or less. Well, think about it. China, South Korea, Taiwan, Thailand, not multi-party democracies. What's the exception to the rule? Some ways of saying what a poor country is. Malta is an exception to the rule, but, very tiny island in the middle of the Mediterranean, that's no guidance. Doesn't that tell us something? India is the closest comparison, I take it, in terms of size and diversity to China. Doesn't that tell us something? You've heard that before, and I wonder what you think.
I think there are multiple pathways to development, and I mean, you're using a very limited definition of development, which is maybe the numbers of people being lifted out of poverty. I'm not denying this achievement. What I'm denying or questioning is whether that justifies one-party rule, which is the line of argument that you keep pursuing. And I don't see it. Why? So lifting people out of poverty, why can't you, after lifting people out of poverty, give them more freedom? What prevents you? Don't you think that they will even be more developed, the poor part of the country, if you give them more freedom to pursue not just business, but also community work, freedom of speech and ideas, so on and so forth. I mean, there's no art. It doesn't mean that, once you've done something good, then whatever bad things you do later on is justifiable because you've done the country good. And this is exactly the line that the party has been towing and telling its own people. And I don't think its own people buys it. They can keep saying it 1,000 times and make it sounds true, but people are not buying it not because we have entry into their heads, but because of what they do. We see people wanting more, and the young people that have come to your university, you talk to them. They want more freer internet. They even have lost faith in the fact that there will be democracy in China. People in China don't even talk about democracy. The term in Chinese, you never hear it in any spontaneous conversation because people see it as such an illusion, as fake. I mean, what are you talking about? This is China, democracy here? No, they don't talk about that anymore. So that is the extent to which people have given hope that inside China, this party is going to allow them more political freedom, but people who have come to this country or other countries to live and work and study, they see there is an alternative way of life that they aspire to, and so I don't think lifting people out of poverty is a sufficient yardstick to measure the achievement of a one-party state. I mean, you seem to use that as the golden rule to say that it's fine if we can lift so many people out of poverty. But poor people also want more than just being lifted out of poverty. So it's like if our ultimate goal is to, as you said, liberate the people. You better know what these people want and what they want to be liberated from.
Let's talk about that. I think, looking at the past, we might or might not disagree about forms of freedom and ways in which it can be absent. I expect we would both agree that someone who is constantly struggling to survive, in an important sense, is not free. But now you're saying, what about afterwards?
Yeah.
Okay, first of all, what's your sense of what most people want in China, not people like the students who come to the United States, the professors. Mm-hmm. We know, as you know, in the surveys, in the Pew surveys, 85% say they're satisfied with the direction their country is going.
What survey is that?
The Pew has this international survey in which they ask.
In China?
They ask it in China, and they ask it in the U.S. In the U.S., it's like maybe 30%. Anyway, a lot less. But, people wonder what those responses mean. You ask people, are you satisfied, in China, are you satisfied with the pace of movements toward democracy? Most people say yes, and, surveys conducted by Taiwan or U.S.-based organizations. In lots of these surveys, they're willing to say harsh things about corruption and the like, harsh things about officials who could hurt them. But maybe they're being careful about not saying what the center doesn't want them to say.
Yeah.
So one thing you do is you talk to people. You just go by numbers.
Yes.
So in China, putting people like us, professors, to one side, are most people frustrated by the lack of democracy that frustrates you?
I think people are frustrated by lack of freedom to choose. For example, farmers. Now, there are farmers that I've talked to who don't want to give up the rural resident status. They want to remain farmers because, as long as you remain farmers, you have a piece of land that is permanently yours. You're still entitled to a piece of land. And don't want to move to the city. They don't want to become an urban resident and live in high rises. But these days, and as has always been in China, you don't have the freedom to choose. The government said we want 60% urban population by the year 2050. Then there is this national policy to systematically push as many people as necessary to reach that 60% urbanization target, which means even if you're happy with your being a farmer in your home province, you don't want to leave that place to go to the city to become part of this urbanization pattern. You have no choice. And these days, people see the value to their land. Not everybody is this second generation of migrant workers who aspire to be an urban resident. There are a lot of people who like to be on the land doing farming, and they want to have this very substantive material security that you have a piece of land to farm no matter how the market economy changes. And I've met quite a few of these in northeastern China, in the villages. But they're worried that one day they'll be made into part of this urban population. So the freedom to choose is, even among people who are not dealing with abject poverty or have to worry about starvation, we can't assume that everybody wants to leave the rural economy and want to participate in the urban kind of style of life. I mean, there are people who just want their piece of land. And there are a lot of farmers for a generation, for centuries. This is the most traditional, basic desire of Chinese peasant, is the security of that piece of land. And with this kind of government, the one-party state, they may raise GDP growth, raise per capita income on the aggregate level, but they won't allow people who don't want these things. They just want a way of life, that they have the security to that piece of land. And that's not allowed. And I think this is the part that I want to emphasize. In an one-party state, the one-party state decides what your needs are. You can't define your own need and stick to it.
Isn't that kind of involuntary displacement part of modern economic life? In the United States, the farming population has gone down, with lots of displacement. People were outcompeted by agribusiness. Sometimes they fought back through policies that were ecologically unsound. That created a so-called Dust Bowl effect in the 1930s. So the people who had to leave their land weren't ordered. They just would have starved otherwise. They were dispossessed by a bank often,
Yes.
which was responding to a choice they made. They chose to take out a loan. They couldn't have survived otherwise.
Right.
Isn't that a loss of freedom on the same scale, workers are thrown out of work involuntarily in the United States as well, displaced by time. Okay, why?
That's the work of the market, and why
do you think it's okay if it's the work of the market?
No, I'm not saying it's okay, but why do you need a state? You need a state to counter the market.
Yes.
And I think that's what the role of the Chinese government can do, and has the power to do, to protect workers or peasants from the vagaries of the market, and at the same time allow them the freedom to choose, the right to choose whether they want to stay in the countryside or whether they want to go into the city. I don't see why, if it happens to people without protection of the government, it's bad. It's equally bad that if you're subjected to this tsunami that is caused by the market. But if you have the government can protect you, but also it gives you the right to choose. What's wrong with that?
Well, the right to choose, I guess there's a process of displacement to be managed. And the question is not how can everything be what people want, but is a one-party regime better at managing it, or in any case,
why would a
not
one-party
worse?
regime be able to managing this thing better? I don't get the logic there.
Oh, because the rate of dispossession and migration is of no interest to the local bank that's calling in the mortgage on a farm.
Well, the U.S. government could at that point, had it subscribed to another ideology, the U.S. government could have done something to protect those people who were displaced because of the Great Recession or because of the Dust Bowl or whatnot. But it's just a choice of the U.S. government that they think of the state in a different way, that it should be limiting role of the state and allow the markets to operate. It's more like a liberal ideology that has constrained the state. It doesn't mean that, you have a state and that's why the state can never do anything. You can have a very progressive state like in Europe, more regulated kind of market economy where the state plays a better role in protecting people from the market. And they are democracies, social democracy. So you don't necessarily have to have democracy, authoritarian state only that can protect people effectively. And then once you have democracy, you can't. I think the U.S. is only one peculiar case of democratic systems where, it is ideology and the people's culture is that they think they are distrustful of the state. They don't really embrace the state as a positive institution and as a space. They see autonomy, define independence and autonomy as something away from the state rather than using the state to achieve social goals. But if you look at Europe, Northern Europe, Scandinavian Europe, or some continental European countries, they are capitalist systems, they are democratic systems, but they embrace a different view of what the government can do. France and Germany, for instance.
So you're saying, in your view, what's realistic? You clearly, not in terms of power politics, but what's realistic in terms of resources and the attitudes of people who are not in power for China is to be Sweden in its institutions, despite the diversity of China, despite the conflicts of interest that it creates, despite the residual poverty, despite the need for foreign direct investment, despite all that. In a way, you seem hopeful, though also frustrated by the people in power. Despite all that, China could now be a social democracy.
No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm not saying that at
all. Okay.
I will never imagine that China will, under the Chinese Communist Party, become a social democratic system. No, I'm not seeing the possibility for that. But I think, to argue with you, friendly argument, is that I think one-party state is not necessarily the only possible institution or system that would lift people out of poverty, and a democratic system does not necessarily is less protective of people's livelihood.
Okay, so
I'm not saying that China will in the foreseeable future, become a system like Scandinavia, or Germany or France, a social democratic system. I'm not seeing that at all, given where this current leadership is going.
That's what I meant. That's
but
the
I think-
leadership is standing in the way of
Right.
that goal.
But if you ask me if ordinary people have that kind of aspiration that are kind of similar to social democracies in Europe, yes. Actually, as you said, I talk to workers a lot, and some of the workers who are more informed about what's going on, the older generation, they actually talk about welfare. They want welfare. That part of the Chinese state they want, like under state socialism. They want the protection of the government in terms of housing and medical care and education and whatnot, but they also want the freedom to choose their jobs, and more freedom in terms of expression. So you have a very protected kind of social policy by the state, enforced by the state and provided by the state, as well as political freedom under a competitive party system. And if you call that social democracy, I think a lot of people in China aspire to that. But do they see that as a possibility? Do I see that as a possibility in the near future in China? No.